Imagine a boy in the 1930s who counted pennies the way other children counted stars. He made a vow, early and hard-edged, never be poor again. That vow, hammered into him by the Great Depression and a grandfather who wore judicial robes and intolerance for waist-like armor, traveled with him through a life that included a divorce, near financial ruin, the death of a child, and then, paradoxically to some, the building of ideas and decisions that helped shape one of the most consequential business partnerships of the 20th century. This is Charlie Munger's life, how tragedy and discipline combined to sharpen a mind that, with Warren Buffett, would help steward a company now measured in trillions. If this story matters to you and you like deep business biographies, subscribe and stick around for the details. He was born in Omaha in 1924 into a family that treated money like a tool and scarcity like a teacher. His grandfather, Thomas Charles Munger, a federal judge, set an early standard of seriousness. Not moralistic sermonizing, but an insistence on responsibility. Charlie learned early that work was not only dignity, but also a safeguard. To be dependent was to be vulnerable. Those lessons were wrapped in the sounds of a small-town store where he spent long hours. The clink of coins, the scuff of boots, the ledger's neat lines. The Great Depression did not just shape his politics or his bank account. It formed his muscle memory for avoiding scarcity. He later said in his laconic way that poverty left a permanent impression. It taught an aversion to the helplessness he had watched around him. Those early practical lessons married to an intellectual curiosity. He loved to read. He loved to learn how things were built. During World War II, he trained as a meteorologist. Maps, physics, prediction under uncertainty. That technical training mattered. Meteorology is the discipline of models and probabilities. It forces you to quantify what you know and, crucially, what you do not. After the war, he pursued the law at Harvard, despite an unconventional academic path. His entrance into Harvard law was not theatrical luck. It was persistence and an accumulation of reputation capital. The legal mind sharpened another tool he would carry into business: rigorous, first principles thinking. Facts mattered. Logic mattered more. Charlie moved into law, started a practice, and for a time his life followed a respectable arc. Professional growth, marriage to Nancy Huggins, the settling in of family life. But life, as it often does, introduced fractures. The marriage faltered under strain, divorce followed, personal pain compounded when his young son, Ted, fell ill and died of leukemia. There is no rhetorical flourish that can dignify the empty chairs and the nights in hospital corridors. The death of Ted was an unmitigated human tragedy, and Charlie felt it the way any father would, raw and private. He later reflected that the loss left him with an acute distaste for self-pity. It did not make him more callous. It made him more resolute to avoid the indulgence of feeling sorry for himself. "Never feel sorry for yourself," he would say in brief, blunt aphorisms. That line, often repeated, was not a moralizing slogan, but a personal rule born of pain. Financial troubles followed. He had business ventures that sunk and left him facing a harsh reckoning. There is a kind of collapse that is both economic and existential. Losing money is one thing. Losing the sense that you can control your life is another. For a man who had promised himself autonomy, the combination of marital breakdown, bereavement, and near ruin could have been fatal in every sense. Instead, it became a pivot. He returned to his roots in Omaha, found steadiness in a second marriage to Nancy Berry, and, crucially, in a small decisive social moment, met Warren Buffett at a dinner in 1959. The meeting was not a cinematic thunderclap. It was a quiet recognition. Two minds with different strengths saw complementarity. Buffett's temperament and love for arbitrage, and Charlie's merciless rigor and appetite for multidisciplinary thinking. The partnership began as intellectual curiosity and became an operational alliance that would last decades. In the years that followed, the habits Charlie developed during childhood and war, frugality, relentless reading, scientific thinking, turned into investment advantages. Early real estate deals funded ventures. He did well, then stopped. Not because he could not continue, but because the discipline of stopping at an appropriate point is itself a strategic choice. He learned to prefer ownership over short-term speculation. Ownership grants control and aligns the incentives of managers and owners. Those legal instincts found their matching in a preference for businesses with durable moats, predictable cash flows, and competent management, qualities that could survive the inevitable shocks of markets and life. To make those abstract habits concrete, consider the idea of the circle of competence. Charlie explained it simply: know what you understand, and, much more importantly, know what you do not. For an investor, this circle is the safe working field where probabilistic judgment is at its best. Stray outside it, and error multiplies. It is not a static boundary. It grows with study. But arrogance makes it porous. Charlie's counsel, again blunt and aphoristic, was to stay within that circle and to expand it slowly through disciplined learning. For him, reading was the muscle that expanded the circle. He read not for amusement, but to feed a portfolio of mental models: physics, economics, psychology, law. Accumulate models, then use the appropriate one when the moment demands. One of the first small but revealing case studies of his approach is See's Candies. He saw an opportunity, a well-run business whose cash flows and customer loyalty made it a good investment. He invested what, by some accounts, was about $25,000, a modest sum that taught lessons disproportionate to its size. See's Candies also presented an early test of intellectual courage. When imitators and legal threats arose, people copying packaging, undercutting prices, trying to ride on the brand, Charlie did what a lawyer and owner does. He defended the moat. Protecting what you own, even in petty local fights, is part of protecting value. The battle was legal, stubborn, and principled. In those skirmishes, the mind that had spent time in courtrooms found its role in corporate defense. This was not aggression for its own sake. It was a defense of the economic and intangible moat the company had built. Contrast that with another high-risk episode, British Columbia Power. This was not a small candy business. This was a large, concentrated bet where his conviction approached the level of near-total commitment. For a period, Charlie and partners put significant capital into utilities and energy assets in British Columbia. The bet was a study in concentration versus diversification. When you understand something deeply and you believe the odds tilt in your favor, concentration amplifies returns. It also amplifies pain when markets turn. Charlie had learned that lesson the hard way. Volatility is not a foreign concept to someone trained in meteorology. The weather changes, storms arrive, and markets are in some ways a social weather system. The British Columbia investment paid off handsomely in time, but it required stomach and a tolerance for the discomfort of being heavily exposed. The early partnership years were not unbroken success. In 1973-74, a severe market downturn exposed the psychological brittleness of some partners. Great lessons in finance are often lessons in human conduct. Fear, greed, and the temptation to act precipitously under stress. Charlie dissolved a partnership in that period, a decision driven by losses and the recognition that volatility did not only affect the balance sheet, it affected judgment. He later said that volatility destroys the human capacity to think clearly. The liquidation of the partnership was a lesson in humility. It taught that staying power required not only intellectual conviction, but also aligning investor temperaments with investment strategies. One sound portfolio idea executed with nervous investors is a mismatch destined for ruin. Meeting Warren Buffett turned a private practice of reasoning into something larger. Charlie's influence on Buffett is often understated in public narratives. He brought a more systematic set of mental models and a taste for concentrated long-term bets on excellent businesses. This nudged Buffett away from the sole playbook of buying cheap assets toward the concept of buying wonderful businesses at fair prices. Together, their combined practices, Buffett's temperament and capital, Charlie's multidisciplinary rigor, transformed a textile company called Berkshire Hathaway from a value play into a holding company that allocated cash into durable franchises. Insurance companies, utilities, consumer brands, and later, significant stakes in companies like Coca-Cola and Bank of America. Charlie argued for structural reasons to prefer ownership when possible. Owning a cash-flowing business gives you both existing earnings and optionality for future reinvestment. A recurring motif in Charlie's life was a mental swimming never stop. He used swimming as a private metaphor for persistence. Keep moving. Keep staying afloat intellectually. That image explains his daily habit of reading widely and his insistence that lifelong learning is the core competitive advantage. A man with a library and curiosity beats a man with a single trick. This relentless appetite for reading allowed him to spot psychological biases, common errors in reasoning, and repeatable patterns across industries. The models accumulated over decades were not theoretical ornaments. They were practical tools for deciding when to hold, when to buy, and when to accept loss. Charlie's letters, speeches, and conversations are strewn with aphorisms because they compress big lessons into small sentences that are easy to remember. There's no such thing as a free lunch, warns against gullibility, and suggests trade-offs are always present. Quality over price pushed against the bargain-hunting instinct. Sometimes paying a premium for a superb business is wiser than buying a mediocre firm on sale. These are not strict axioms, but heuristics, mental shortcuts that, for Charlie, minimized mistakes. The See's Candies episode echoed on a larger scale in contests over intellectual property, brand, and the right to a margin. Those battles were not symbols, but practical defense mechanisms that made a business investable. Charlie's legal training made him impatient with sloppy thinking about incentives. Create ownership and align incentives so that managers act like owners. Otherwise, The gap between spoken promises and actual behavior becomes a leak that drains value. Berkshire Hathaway itself became the grand experiment in scale and temperament. Buffett's letters to shareholders reveal the iterative influence between the two men. Charlie argued for decentralization. Let competent managers run businesses, because the cost of micromanaging at scale becomes crippling. He insisted on a strong corporate culture and on capital allocation discipline. Cash should be deployed where it has the best long-term return prospects, not to satisfy short-term market narratives. This management of cash flows, reinvestment, and acquisitions, amplified across decades, compounded into extraordinary aggregate results. But Charlie was never a prophet about perpetual outperformance. He insisted that outperformance becomes harder as assets balloon. A billion-dollar strategy is easier to implement for a small partnership than for a company managing hundreds of billions. He taught that humility about scale is as important as ambition. When mention is made of Berkshire and its modern holdings, it can be tempting to treat success as destiny. Charlie was careful to avoid that fallacy. He acknowledged the role of chance, the limits of scaling, and the ever-present possibility of regime change in markets. The advice was not to act as if the past guaranteed the future. He also warned smaller investors that the same principles, patience, concentration in what you know, habitually expanding your competence, can be adapted to their circumstances. A small investor's advantage is agility. Rapid reallocation is less costly when the pool is small. Charlie advised leveraging your edges, not chasing fads. Consider the 1973-74 episode again not only as a lesson about money, but as a moral on temperament. Markets will inflict pain. How you respond to pain reveals your strategy's real heart. Do you double down blindly? Do you panic sell? Or do you use the pain to test your models? Charlie favored the latter. When the model failed, he adjusted. He prized the ability to change one's mind based on evidence. This intellectual flexibility, to prefer models that yield to data, was the same trait that had made him leave law for investing, and later to pivot from small businesses to buying stakes in great ones. Throughout, one can track a clear thread from personal tragedy to practical habit without making a simplistic causal claim. The death of Ted did not directly cause a particular stock purchase years later, but Charlie later reflected that the experience hardened his refusal to indulge in self-pity, shortened his moral tolerance for excuses, and sharpened his willingness to do the difficult work of continuous reading and rigorous thinking. Loss made habits less ornamental and more imperative. When life had shown him how quickly control can be lost, he built systems that increased control, ownership, careful selection, and a rigorous defense of what mattered. Another essential element of his method was an understanding of incentives. Coming from a legal background and having watched institutions and people operate in predictable ways, Charlie embedded incentive analysis into his mental models. Who benefits from a decision? What perverse rewards does a system create? These questions are the guardrails that stop clever narratives from overruling simple truths about human behavior. A great business with perverse incentives is a minefield. A mediocre business with aligned incentives can be safer than a dazzling brand with a rotten internal logic. Charlie's life was also a study in honesty about errors. He did not present himself as infallible. His early partnerships, the losses, the closed ventures, these were cataloged frankly. He refused to hide mistakes behind rhetoric. In that honesty, there is a practical lesson. When you catalog your errors, you learn faster. He translated personal humility into systemic learning. The aphorism about never feeling sorry for yourself does not mean skipping mourning. It means refusing to let grief calcify into paralysis. The motion of the mind matters. Keep swimming. That is the more accurate rendering of his private metaphor. There are modern examples often cited to frame the enduring applicability of Charlie and Buffett's logic. Investments in consumer staples like Coca-Cola, long-term underwriting successes in insurance, and later stakes in financial institutions reflect a thesis about buying durable, cash-generative businesses that need little tinkering. When Berkshire invested in companies that fit their circle of competence, they could afford to be patient. The results over decades were significant. Compound growth that outpaced broad markets in many periods. Yet Charlie insisted always on the caveat. Past compounding, while instructive, is not a prophecy. Scale cuts both ways. As capital grows, finding opportunities that move the needle becomes harder, and the distribution of returns shifts. There was also a pragmatic moral side to his view of wealth. He framed money not as a trophy, but as freedom. Financial success allowed choices to support family, to avoid dependence, to allocate capital to ventures that served long-term customers. He resisted narrating capital accumulation as inherently virtuous. It was to him a means, a tool to preserve independence and to enable deliberate action. That perspective kept his arguments grounded and avoided the dangerous glamorization of wealth as a moral end in itself. Toward the end of his public life, Charlie distilled these experiences into practical counsel that reads like a checklist for sound judgment. Read widely and relentlessly. Stick to what you know. Prefer quality businesses over cheap bargains. Be willing to concentrate bets when conviction is strong. Cultivate the temperament to sit through losses without irrational behavior. And finally, keep a modest opinion of what you can reliably predict. He would often repeat that change of mind based on evidence is not weakness, but intelligence in action. Those pocket aphorisms are memorable because they are compact translations of long, often painful, life experiments. At a human level, it is important to restate what must never be minimized. Tragedy was real, private, and often brutal. Ted's death, the divorce, the near bankruptcy, these were not plot devices. They were lived experiences that left scars. The script of Charlie Munger's life does not pretend they were good things that produced a tidy benefit. Rather, the narrative that connects those tragedies to later success is interpretive and respectful. Suffering shaped habits, hardened resolve, and clarified priorities. That distinction matters. It keeps the dignity of lived pain intact while acknowledging that human beings sometimes turn loss into recalibrated effort and sharper judgment. There is also an ethic in his practice of business. Fight when it matters, and avoid pettiness when it does not. In See's Candies, he defended a moat with legal tenacity. Elsewhere, he let competent managers run without micromanaging them. He trusted decentralized people, but he wanted incentives aligned. He treated shareholders as partners, not opponents. Those choices reflect a set of moral commitments as much as strategic ones. Stewardship responsibility, and a pragmatic disdain for vanity. If there is a climax to this life story, it is not one triumphant moment, but the cumulative consequence of disciplined habits applied across decades. Compound interest works in finance and in character. Small rules followed consistently create outsized outcomes. That is the sober philosophical spine of Charlie Munger's trajectory. Tragedy did not guarantee a trillion-dollar company. It did, however, tighten the screws on a mindset that prized clarity, reading, and relentless correction of error. Those habits, multiplied by a partnership with Warren Buffett and amplified by the structural choices at Berkshire Hathaway, were part of how value accumulation and responsible allocation of capital produced extraordinary scale. What then are the practical takeaways, stripped of rhetoric and suited for imitation in modest, realistic measures? First, cultivate a circle of competence and expand it through reading and disciplined study, not through bravado. Second, value quality. Sometimes a fair price for a superb business beats a cheap price for a mediocre one. Third, concentrate where conviction is real, but only if the temperament and capital alignment allow it. Fourth, be honest about mistakes. Catalog them, learn from them, and correct course. Fifth, protect your psychological capacity to think. Avoid excessive leverage, align partners with temperament, and build strategies that your investors can live with in rain and shine. Sixth, treat losses and personal tragedies with respect. Do not rush to extract moral lessons, but be open to the subtle ways hardship clarifies priorities and reduces indulgence in excuses. Charlie Munger's story is not a parable that promises imitation will yield identical outcomes. It is, instead, a record of how a life of deprivation and grief, combined with intellectual rigor and legal discipline, to produce a mental toolkit for business and investing. The tools are concrete. First principles, models drawn from many disciplines, an emphasis on incentives, and the stubborn habit of reading. The mindset is simpler but harder. Stoic acceptance of misfortune without becoming paralyzed by it, and intellectual humility that allows for changing one's mind when evidence demands. We close where we began. A boy in Omaha, determined not to be poor, who learned to swim through a life of storms. He never pretended that suffering was a neat cause of success. He did insist, with his customary bluntness, that it forced decisions to be practical, not ornamental. There is dignity in that restraint. For anyone watching this who has faced hardship, the invitation is modest. Reflect on how your losses have shaped what you value. Double down on habits that produce clarity, and remember that steady, humble work accumulates into meaningful advantage over time. If this account resonated, please like and share, and check the description for recommended readings, speeches, Berkshire letters, and essays that let you hear the original voice beyond this narrative.